Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we are stepping into a quiet village that no longer exists, but whose fears still echo across history. This is not a story about spells, dark rituals, or fantasy. It is a story about ordinary people living ordinary lives and the extraordinary harm that can grow when fear becomes more powerful than reason. So get comfortable, let the noise of the day fade away, and allow yourself to drift into a chapter of history where danger did not come from magic, but from neighbors, expectations, and silence. When we hear the phrase witch trials in colonial America, it is tempting to imagine something theatrical. We picture dramatic accusations, shadowy figures, and beliefs that feel distant or absurd by modern standards. But the truth is far less fantastical and far more unsettling. Witch trials were not fueled by a genuine obsession with magic. They were fueled by fear, conformity, and the human need to explain discomfort by pointing to a culprit. In colonial New England, life was narrow, fragile, and exhausting. Communities were small, isolated, and deeply dependent on cooperation for survival. Crops failed. Winters were brutal. Disease arrived without warning. Death was common, unpredictable, and poorly understood. In a world without modern medicine or scientific explanations, people searched desperately for meaning behind every misfortune. And when answers did not appear, fear stepped in to fill the gap. Religion offered structure, but it also sharpened anxiety. Many settlers believed they were living under constant spiritual scrutiny, watched not only by God, but by forces that opposed him. This belief did not encourage curiosity or compassion. It encouraged vigilance. Every hardship became a moral test. Every deviation from the norm became a potential threat. And, slowly, quietly, suspicion became a community habit. Witchcraft accusations emerged not because people truly saw magic everywhere, but because difference made people uncomfortable. A woman who spoke too freely, or not at all. Someone who did not marry, or married, and then lived incorrectly afterward. A neighbor who knew too much, or seemed to know too little. These were not crimes. But in a society built on rigid expectations, difference felt dangerous. Conformity was safety. Blending meant survival. Standing out even unintentionally meant exposure. The idea of witchcraft gave shape to unease. It transformed vague discomfort into a concrete explanation. If a child fell ill, if milk spoiled, if crops failed, the cause could not simply be chance. Randomness was terrifying. It implied a world beyond control. But witchcraft offered something emotionally comforting: blame. If something went wrong, someone must have caused it. And if someone caused it, the community could act. This is how fear becomes policy. Importantly, most accusations did not begin with dramatic confrontations. They began with glances, with remembered conversations, with someone quietly noting that a neighbor's behavior fell off. These observations were rarely challenged, because challenging them meant risking suspicion yourself. Silence became agreement. Gossip became evidence. Over time, stories grew more certain with each retelling. What makes this history especially haunting is how little it took to fall under suspicion. No spell was required. No confession. Often, the accused did nothing at all. They simply failed to meet expectations that were impossible to clearly define. They existed slightly out of alignment with the invisible rules of the village. Women were especially vulnerable because their lives were tightly regulated by social norms. They were expected to be obedient but not weak, modest but not withdrawn, knowledgeable but not authoritative. Any imbalance could be interpreted as moral failure. And moral failure, in this worldview, was never private. It threatened the entire community. Fear did not live only in moments of crisis. It lived in daily routines, in how people dressed, in how they spoke, in how often they were seen outside their homes. This constant self-monitoring was exhausting, but it was also normalized. People learned to edit themselves long before anyone accused them of anything. Witch trials, then, were not sudden eruptions of madness. They were the end result of long-standing pressures. They occurred in environments where fear was rewarded, conformity was enforced, and empathy was risky. Once accusations began, logic no longer mattered. Defending yourself could look like guilt. Remaining calm could look like arrogance. Emotion could look like deception. Silence could look like plotting. In such a system, innocence was not protection. It was confusion. And confusion was intolerable. What is perhaps most unsettling is how familiar these patterns feel. While the setting is centuries old, the mechanisms are not. Humans still fear what they cannot explain. Communities still police difference. Rumors still grow stronger when repeated often enough. And people are still tempted to trade understanding for certainty when fear becomes overwhelming. The witch trials remind us that cruelty does not always wear a dramatic face. Sometimes it looks like concern. Sometimes it sounds like moral responsibility. Sometimes it hides behind the belief that harm is necessary for the greater good. These women were not executed because people truly believed they were supernatural threats. They were destroyed because their existence challenged fragile systems built on fear and control. They became symbols onto which anxiety was projected until punishment felt like relief. As we move deeper into this story, remember this: witchcraft was not the disease. It was the diagnosis people invented when they could no longer tolerate uncertainty. And the cost of that invention was paid by ordinary lives caught in extraordinary fear. So tonight, as we continue, we won't be chasing myths or legends. We will be listening to the quiet mechanics of suspicion, the slow tightening of social pressure, and the dangerous comfort of blame. Because history does not only warn us about the past, it asks us to notice how easily fear can still disguise itself as righteousness, and how important it is to recognize it before it finds a new name. In colonial American communities, danger did not come from dramatic acts or open rebellion. It came from subtle misalignment. Women who became targets were rarely extreme figures. They were ordinary individuals whose lives drifted just slightly outside what society quietly demanded of them. And in a culture built on strict, unspoken rules, even the smallest deviation could feel intolerable. To understand why ordinary women were so vulnerable, it is necessary to understand how narrow their acceptable roles truly were. Womanhood was not flexible. It was a script. A woman was expected to marry at the right time, to the right man, to bear children at the right pace, and to manage her household with calm efficiency. She was meant to be visible enough to be useful, but never so visible that she drew attention. She needed to speak when spoken to, but not too much. She needed to work hard, but not appear ambitious. She needed to show faith, but not interpretation. This balance was nearly impossible to maintain, especially in communities where everyone watched everyone else. Women who remained unmarried were immediately suspect, not because singleness itself was dangerous, but because it resisted explanation. Marriage was not only a personal choice, it was a social stabilizer. A married woman belonged to a household that could be categorized and controlled. An unmarried woman existed without a clear place. Her independence, however limited, felt unsettling. People wondered why she had not married. They wondered what kind of person would choose or endure such a life. Questions like these rarely stayed neutral. Widows occupied a similarly unstable position. Without a husband, a widow could own property, manage finances, or make decisions alone. This autonomy was legal, but it was emotionally uncomfortable for neighbors accustomed to male authority. A woman who survived her husband was often viewed with quiet suspicion, especially if she seemed capable or resilient. Survival itself could look like strength, and strength in women was often interpreted as threat. Personality played a role as well. Women who were outspoken risked being labeled difficult or disruptive. Their words carried weight, and weight made people uneasy. But silence offered no protection either. A woman who spoke too little could be labeled cold, secretive, or withdrawn. Either way, deviation invited interpretation, and interpretation rarely leaned toward generosity. Even kindness could be dangerous. A woman who offered help, too often, who knew how to heal, who seemed competent beyond expectation, risked being seen as manipulative. Knowledge was not neutral. It had to be properly sourced, properly sanctioned, and properly limited. When it was not, it raised questions. Where did she learn that? Why does she know so much? What gives her authority? These questions did not need answers. They only needed repetition. Economic status added another layer of vulnerability. Poor women were often suspected because desperation made them unpredictable in the eyes of others. If misfortune struck nearby, it felt easy to imagine that someone with little might want more. At the same time, women who were unexpectedly prosperous faced equal suspicion. Wealth, when not clearly earned through acceptable channels, raised doubts. Prosperity needed explanation, and if no explanation fit neatly, imagination stepped in. Social relationships were equally important. Women who argued with neighbors, who held grudges, or who were simply disliked were at risk. In close-knit communities, personal conflict never stayed private. Dislike fermented into narrative. A harsh word remembered at the wrong moment could later be recalled as evidence of bad intent. Over time, memory reshaped itself to fit fear. What is crucial to understand is that none of these traits were harmful on their own. Being unmarried, outspoken, knowledgeable, poor, wealthy, quiet, or different were not crimes. But colonial society was not structured around individual freedom. It was structured around cohesion. Anything that threatened the illusion of order felt dangerous, even if it caused no harm. Women were especially exposed because their lives were more visible and more regulated. Their work took place in kitchens, gardens, marketplaces, and home spaces constantly observed by others. Privacy was limited. Reputation was collective property. A woman did not own her image. The community did. Once doubt took root, it rarely faded. Suspicion was sticky. Attempts to correct it often failed because defense itself could be interpreted as guilt. Explaining oneself looked like justification. Emotion looked like instability. Calmness looked calculated. There was no correct response once a woman was framed as off. What made this process especially cruel was its ordinariness. Accusations did not require hatred. Often, they emerged from anxiety, envy, or discomfort. People did not always believe they were being cruel. Many believed they were protecting their community. Harm disguised as responsibility is one of the most efficient forms of harm. Over time, patterns formed. Certain women became known as strange, difficult, or troubling long before any formal accusation appeared. These labels followed them quietly, passed between conversations, reinforced by glances and pauses. When crisis eventually arrived in illness, a loss, a failure, these women were already prepared to receive blame. The story simply needed a trigger. In this way, which accusations did not erupt suddenly. They settled. They accumulated. They were built slowly through observation and reinterpretation, until one day, suspicion felt like certainty. The tragedy lies in how little agency these women had. Many did everything they could to comply. They softened their voices, altered their habits, hid their knowledge, restrained their opinions. But constant self-erasure has limits. No one can perfectly anticipate every expectation. And even perfect conformity offered no guarantee. Sometimes, trying too hard to fit in looked suspicious too. What this reveals is that the danger was never individual behavior. It was the system itself, a system that demanded perfection but offered no clear rules, a system that punished difference while pretending to reward morality, a system that required someone to fail so that others could feel safe. These women were not extraordinary figures standing boldly against society. They were ordinary people navigating impossible standards. Their stories remind us that harm does not require villains with malicious intent. It only requires rigid expectations, fear of difference, and the quiet agreement to let suspicion replace understanding. As this story continues, what becomes clear is that the witch trials were not about uncovering hidden threats. They were about enforcing boundaries, social, behavioral, and emotional. And the people most likely to be punished were those who simply could not, or would not, disappear enough to make others comfortable. Life in colonial American communities unfolded under an unrelenting gaze. Privacy, as we understand it today, barely existed. Homes were close together, daily routines predictable, and social boundaries thin. In such an environment, women learned quickly that nothing they did was truly unnoticed. Every movement, habit, and decision carried weight, not because it was inherently meaningful, but because it could be interpreted. Daily life required constant self-monitoring. Women learned to measure themselves not by personal comfort or instinct, but by how their behavior might appear to others. Stepping outside too early or too late, lingering too long at a neighbor's home, or choosing solitude over company could all raise quiet questions. These questions did not need to be spoken aloud to be felt. Awareness of potential judgment shaped behavior long before judgment was ever expressed. This vigilance became a survival skill. Women adjusted their routines to match communal rhythms. They learned when it was acceptable to speak, when silence was safer, and when invisibility was the best protection. Even emotions were managed carefully. Too much grief appeared unstable. Too little grief appeared unnatural. Joy had to be modest. Anger had to be contained. Fear had to be hidden. The body itself became something to regulate. Clothing played a central role in this performance. Dress was not merely practical. It was symbolic. Colors, fabrics, cleanliness, and modesty were all read as moral signals. A garment worn too often suggested poverty or neglect. A garment that appeared too fine invited questions about its source. Even mending choices could be noticed. Clothing was expected to reflect humility, order, and self-control, and failing to meet those expectations could mark someone as careless or vain. Movement through shared spaces carried similar risks. How a woman walked, stood, or sat could be interpreted as evidence of her character. Confidence could be mistaken for pride. Hesitation could be mistaken for secrecy. Physical presence itself became a kind of statement, whether intended or not. Over time, women learned to shrink their gestures, to soften their posture, and to minimize anything that might draw attention. Speech was perhaps the most dangerous territory. Words could linger long after they were spoken, reshaped by memory and repetition. A casual remark made in frustration could later be recalled as bitterness. A joke could be remembered as mockery. A disagreement could transform into hostility in retelling. Knowing this, many women chose their words with extreme care, often defaulting to agreement even when it cost them internally. But silence was not neutral either. Silence invited speculation. A woman who did not participate in conversations risked being seen as aloof or calculating. People wondered what she thought, what she withheld, what she might be hiding. In a culture where transparency was demanded, but privacy was impossible, withholding oneself felt suspicious. This constant evaluation created an internal pressure that never fully released. Even alone, women carried the imagined presence of others with them. They anticipated judgment before it arrived. They rehearsed explanations they hoped they would never need. Over time, This anticipation blurred the line between external control and internal habit. Surveillance became self-surveillance. What makes this especially tragic is that these efforts rarely guaranteed safety. Self-monitoring could reduce risk, but it could not eliminate it. In fact, excessive caution sometimes produced the opposite effect. A woman who appeared overly controlled, overly careful, or overly composed could seem unnatural. Her restraint might be read as deliberate concealment rather than fear. The community's role in this process was subtle but powerful. Observation was not framed as intrusion. It was framed as responsibility. Neighbors believed it was their duty to notice changes, deviations, and irregularities. Attention became a moral act. Looking away felt negligent. In this way, constant observation was justified as care for the collective. Over time, the accumulation of small observations formed unofficial records of behavior. These records lived in memory, conversation, and reputation. A woman might not know exactly what had been noticed or remembered about her, but she could feel its presence. Reputation followed her into every interaction, shaping how others interpreted even her most neutral actions. This environment left little room for rest. Even domestic spaces offered limited refuge. Homes were visited, inspected, and discussed. The interior of a house reflected the character of its keeper. Cleanliness suggested order. Disorder suggested moral weakness. Objects themselves could be read symbolically, turning ordinary tools into potential sources of suspicion. Living under constant observation changed how women understood themselves. Identity became reactive rather than expressive. Instead of asking who they were, women were forced to consider how they appeared. Selfhood narrowed to performance. Authenticity became risky. Predictability became safety. This pressure did not only affect those who were eventually accused. It shaped entire generations of women, teaching them to equate acceptance with disappearance. To survive was to be unremarkable. To be unremarkable was to suppress difference. Over time, this suppression became normalized, passed from mother to daughter as cautionary wisdom. When accusations finally emerged, they often felt sudden to outsiders, but inevitable to those who lived within the system. Years of observation had already built a case, even if no one consciously acknowledged it. A single incident could activate long-held impressions, turning quiet scrutiny into open suspicion. The tragedy of this constant monitoring lies in its efficiency. It required no formal authority, no written rules, and no explicit threats. It functioned through shared expectations and mutual fear. Everyone participated, even those who felt uneasy about it, because stepping outside the system meant risking attention oneself. As the story continues, it becomes clear that the witch trials were not isolated events, but the visible outcomes of an invisible structure. A structure where women lived not just under watch, but within it. And once observation replaces trust, every action becomes evidence, every difference becomes dangerous, and every ordinary life carries the potential to be rewritten as a warning. In colonial American society, the body itself became a text to be read. Appearance was never neutral. Clothing, posture, facial expression, and tone of voice were all treated as outward signs of inward character. For women especially, the body was expected to communicate obedience, humility, and moral restraint at all times. Any deviation, however minor, could be interpreted as evidence of something hidden beneath the surface. Dress was one of the most closely watched elements of daily life. Clothing choices were constrained not only by availability and labor, but by expectation. Colors were meant to be subdued. Fabrics were meant to be practical. Decoration was permitted only within narrow limits. A garment that appeared too fine could suggest vanity or improper ambition. A garment that appeared worn or poorly kept could suggest neglect or moral disorder. Even when women had little control over what they wore, Their clothing was still treated as a deliberate statement. Consistency mattered as much as modesty. Wearing the same clothing too often could draw attention, just as changing one's appearance too frequently could. Any noticeable shift invited speculation. Neighbors asked themselves why a woman dressed differently today than yesterday, why she seemed more careful, or why she seemed less so. These questions rarely required answers. Their existence alone was enough to plant doubt. The body's movement through space was equally significant. How a woman walked, where she stood, how long she lingered, and how she occupied rooms were all quietly judged. Confidence could be interpreted as pride. Hesitation could be read as secrecy. Physical ease could appear improper, while stiffness could suggest tension or concealment. There was no posture that guaranteed safety, only a narrow range that minimized attention. Facial expression carried its own risks. A woman who smiled too easily might be seen as frivolous or insincere. A woman who rarely smiled might be labeled cold or unapproachable. Grief needed to be visible, but not overwhelming. Calmness was expected, but excessive calm could feel unsettling in moments of crisis. Emotions had to be displayed correctly, at the correct volume, and for the correct duration. Tone of voice became another form of evidence. Speaking too softly risked appearing evasive. Speaking too firmly risked appearing aggressive. Emotional expression was permitted only within tight boundaries. Anger, in particular, was dangerous. A woman who showed frustration could later be remembered as volatile or bitter, even if the moment passed without incident. Memory reshaped tone into intent. What made this scrutiny especially oppressive was its permanence. A single moment could be remembered long after it had lost its original context. A raised voice during stress, a sharp look during grief, or a distracted posture during exhaustion could later be recalled as proof of character. The body never escaped interpretation, even when it was reacting naturally to fatigue or pain. This focus on the body created a constant pressure to perform morality rather than live it. Women learned to manage not only their actions, but their expressions. They practiced restraint as a visible virtue. Over time, this restraint became habitual, shaping how women inhabited their own bodies. Movements became smaller. Gestures became controlled. Emotional responses were softened before they ever reached the surface. The expectation was not authenticity, but predictability. A woman's body was meant to be readable, familiar, and reassuring. Anything unexpected disrupted that reassurance. When people felt unsettled without knowing why, they often blamed the person who made them feel that way. The body became the easiest target for this discomfort. Illness complicated this further. Physical weakness, chronic pain, or visible difference made women even more vulnerable. A body that did not behave normally drew attention. Symptoms that lingered without clear explanation invited suspicion. People wondered whether such conditions reflected moral failing or hidden wrongdoing. The boundary between health and character blurred. Age also played a role. Younger women were scrutinized for signs of impropriety, while older women were scrutinized for signs of bitterness or resentment. The aging female body, especially when paired with independence or isolation, unsettled cultural expectations. A woman who outlived her perceived usefulness or desirability was often viewed with discomfort rather than respect. The body inside the home was no safer than the body in public. Domestic spaces were visited, inspected, and discussed. A woman's household reflected her discipline and control. Disorder suggested inner chaos. Cleanliness suggested moral reliability. Even fatigue could look like neglect. The labor required to maintain an acceptable appearance, both personal and domestic, was relentless. Attempts to consciously manage appearance could backfire. A woman who seemed overly careful might be accused of trying to hide something. Effort itself could look strategic. The line between natural Behavior and calculated performance was thin and subjective, and women had no control over how others decided to interpret it. Once suspicion took hold, the body became a collection of signs waiting to be assembled into a narrative. A stiff posture could be recalled alongside a sharp remark. A serious expression could be linked to a past disagreement. These fragments were woven together into a story that felt coherent, even if it was deeply unfair. What is striking is how little evidence was required. The body does not need to act strangely to be interpreted as strange. It only needs to be noticed at the wrong time by the wrong person. In a culture primed to search for meaning in behavior, neutrality was almost impossible. This intense focus on bodily signs also discouraged empathy. Instead of asking what a woman might be feeling or experiencing, observers asked what her behavior suggested. Human complexity was flattened into symbols. Exhaustion became laziness. Pain became irritability. Grief became instability. The body's language was translated into moral judgment. Over time, this system trained people to distrust appearances while simultaneously relying on them. Observers believed they could detect hidden truths through careful watching, even as they ignored context and circumstance. This confidence made correction difficult. Once someone believed they could see something wrong, alternative explanations felt unnecessary. The tragedy of this scrutiny lies in its circular logic. Women were expected to appear morally correct at all times, yet any effort to control appearance could be viewed as suspicious. Natural expression was risky, but so was restraint. The body became a trap, where every option carried potential consequences. As the story continues, it becomes increasingly clear that which accusations did not depend on extraordinary behavior. They depended on ordinary bodies placed under extraordinary pressure. When appearance becomes evidence and behavior becomes proof, the human body stops being a home and becomes a liability. And in such a system, survival depends not on who you are, but on how convincingly you can disappear into expectation. The home was meant to be a place of safety, but in colonial American communities, it rarely functioned that way. Domestic space was not private in the modern sense. It was porous, observable, and open to interpretation. Every object within it, every tool, container, plant, and habit could be reimagined as something else if suspicion took root. What was ordinary in one context could become ominous in another, depending entirely on who was looking and why. Households relied on practical items to survive. Herbs were gathered for cooking and basic care. Kettles boiled water for meals and warmth. Brooms swept dirt from packed floors. Needles, thread, jars, and tools were necessities of daily labor. Yet these same objects were easily stripped of their context and transformed into symbols. Once fear entered the room, usefulness could be redefined as intent. Herbs were among the most vulnerable items to reinterpretation. Women commonly dried plants for seasoning, teas, or simple remedies. This knowledge was passed through experience rather than formal instruction, making it difficult to explain or defend. To an anxious observer, a bundle of dried leaves could look deliberate, secretive, or excessive. The question was never how the herbs were used, but why they were kept at all. Containers carried similar risks. Jars filled with oils, powders, or preserved foods were everyday sights, yet they invited speculation. Why was this stored? Why was it sealed? Why was it kept out of sight? The absence of a visible explanation was enough to spark imagination. Once imagination took over, evidence no longer needed to be accurate. It only needed to feel convincing. Even cleanliness could become suspicious. A home that was unusually orderly might suggest obsession or concealment. A home that appeared disordered might suggest moral failure. There was no safe level of domestic presentation. Any deviation from an invisible norm could be framed as meaningful, especially if the woman who kept the home was already viewed as questionable. The layout of space mattered too. Where items were placed, which rooms were locked, and which areas were avoided all became subjects of quiet attention. A chest kept closed too often could be interpreted as hiding something. A room seldom used could be imagined as a place of secret activity. The imagination filled gaps that curiosity could not safely explore. Tools used for labor were equally vulnerable. Knives, hooks, ropes, and weights were common and necessary, but they carried symbolic weight as well. Their presence did not imply harm, yet under suspicion, they could be reinterpreted as instruments with alternate purposes. Context collapsed. A tool's function shifted based on narrative, rather than reality. Animals within the household added another layer of vulnerability. Cats, dogs, and livestock were common companions and resources. Yet animals that behaved oddly, lingered too closely, or survived when others did not could attract attention. People watched how animals responded to certain women, projecting meaning onto ordinary behavior. Familiarity became fixation. The home itself became a reflection of character. People believed that a woman's inner state shaped her surroundings. If something felt unsettling inside a home, that feeling could be attributed to the woman rather than to circumstance. Dampness, darkness, or silence took on symbolic meaning. The house stopped being shelter and became testimony. Visits from neighbors intensified this scrutiny. People entered homes not just to socialize, but to observe. They noticed what was displayed and what was hidden. They compared one home to another, one household routine to the next. Differences stood out. Differences demanded explanation. And explanation was rarely charitable. What made this especially dangerous was that women had little control over how their homes were interpreted. Poverty limited choices. Illness disrupted routines. Weather damaged structures. Yet these factors were rarely considered. Instead, outcomes were moralized. A broken fence suggested neglect. A poorly stocked pantry suggested irresponsibility. A full pantry suggested greed or improper acquisition. Objects also carried memory. An item seen once might be recalled later, reshaped by fear and time. A jar remembered vaguely could become more sinister with each retelling. A tool once noted casually could later be described as unusual. Memory did not preserve accuracy. It preserved feeling. And fear sharpened those feelings into certainty. Attempts to explain these objects often failed. Explanations sounded defensive. Details sounded rehearsed. Practical reasoning could be dismissed as deception. Once suspicion framed the narrative, evidence was no longer evaluated. It was collected selectively. Objects were not examined for what they were, but for how well they fit the story. The danger extended beyond individual items to patterns. A woman who gathered herbs, kept animals, lived alone, and maintained a quiet household could have these unrelated facts woven into a single narrative. The home became a stage where every prop supported the same conclusion. Context disappeared. Coincidence hardened into intention. What is striking is how little imagination was required. The symbols already existed in cultural language. People had been taught which objects were associated with danger, secrecy, or improper knowledge. They did not invent new meanings. They activated old ones. The home became a repository of these meanings, waiting for the right conditions to be unlocked. This process stripped women of the ability to define their own space. The home, shaped by their labor, no longer belonged to them. It belonged to public interpretation. Their private routines became public property. Their survival strategies became suspicious habits. The emotional toll of this reinterpretation was profound. Women learned to limit what they kept, how they stored it, and how it appeared. They hid necessities to avoid attention, only to risk suspicion for secrecy. They reduced their tools, even when it made life harder. They simplified their homes until comfort disappeared, believing discomfort was safer than notice. But reduction was not protection. Minimalism could look deliberate. Absence could look like concealment. The logic was inescapable. Once a woman was viewed through suspicion, her home could not be neutral. It could only confirm what people believed they already knew. This reimagining of domestic space reveals how deeply fear penetrated everyday life. The witch. Trials did not require secret gatherings or dramatic acts. They required only the reinterpretation of the familiar. A kettle did not need to be unusual to become suspicious. It needed only to be noticed at the wrong moment. The home, once a place of labor and rest, became a risk environment. Every object carried potential meaning beyond its function. Every choice left a trace that could later be revisited. Living itself became an exercise in avoidance. As the story continues, it becomes clear that witch accusations thrived not on the extraordinary, but on the ordinary made unstable. When common objects are stripped of context and filled with fear, reality loses its grounding. And in that space, accusation becomes easier than understanding, because imagination demands less effort than empathy. Gossip was not a side effect of colonial life. It was a system. In small, tightly bound communities, information traveled quickly and informally, passing from conversation to conversation without ever needing to be written down. What began as observation easily transformed into interpretation, and interpretation hardened into shared belief. Gossip became the mechanism through which communities monitored behavior, reinforced norms, and quietly decided who belonged and who did not. Unlike formal authority, gossip required no official role. Anyone could participate, and nearly everyone did. It thrived in kitchens, marketplaces, churchyards, and doorways. These exchanges were rarely dramatic. They sounded like concern, curiosity, or casual remark. Yet over time, they built detailed profiles of individuals, especially women, based not on fact, but on repetition. Gossip functioned as surveillance. People noticed who left home early, who returned late, who visited whom, and how often. Patterns were discussed and compared. Deviations stood out. A woman who altered her routine without explanation became a topic of conversation. No single detail mattered much on its own, but accumulated details formed a narrative that felt coherent, even if it was inaccurate. This process relied heavily on memory, which was selective and emotional rather than precise. Conversations did not preserve events as they happened. They preserved how events felt. Discomfort, envy, or irritation colored recall. Over time, stories were refined, simplified, and aligned with communal expectations. Details that supported suspicion were emphasized. Details that contradicted it faded. Gossip also carried moral weight. Sharing information was framed as responsibility rather than intrusion. People believed it was necessary to warn others, to remain vigilant, to protect the community. This framing allowed harm to disguise itself as care. Speaking about someone felt virtuous, even when it caused damage. Women were both the primary subjects and primary participants in gossip, though not always by choice. Their social roles placed them in spaces where conversation flowed naturally. Refusing to engage could itself be seen as suspicious. Silence could be interpreted as secrecy or superiority. Participation, however, meant contributing to a system that could easily turn against them. What made gossip especially powerful was its invisibility. There was no single source to confront, no clear accusation to refute. Suspicion spread without a face. A woman might sense a shift in how she was treated without knowing exactly why. Smiles cooled. Invitations faded. Help became conditional. By the time formal accusations emerged, the groundwork had already been laid. Gossip also flattened complexity. People are contradictory, emotional, and inconsistent, but gossip prefers clarity. It transforms ambiguity into certainty. A woman becomes difficult, strange, or troubling, and that label begins to guide how everything she does is interpreted. Actions are no longer evaluated independently. They are filtered through reputation. Conflict played a significant role in this process. Personal disagreements rarely remained private. Resentment sought validation, and gossip provided it. A neighbor who felt slighted could find agreement through shared complaint. Over time, personal grievance blended into communal judgment. What began as an argument became a character assessment. Importantly, gossip did not require malicious intent. Many participants believed they were simply talking. But talk creates reality when repeated often enough. In environments with limited mobility and constant proximity, words accumulated weight quickly. Once a narrative formed, challenging it meant challenging the group, and few were willing to take that risk. Fear reinforced this silence. People understood that defending someone who was already viewed as questionable could draw attention to themselves. Sympathy became dangerous. Neutrality became a strategy. In this way, gossip isolated its subjects while binding its participants together. Unity was achieved through exclusion. Over time, gossip created informal records of behavior. These records had no official status, yet they were treated as truth. When crises occurred, these remembered stories provided ready explanations. A misfortune needed a cause, and gossip supplied a list of candidates. The same names surfaced repeatedly, not because they were responsible, but because they were familiar. Gossip also allowed communities to enforce norms without open confrontation. Instead of directly correcting behavior, people talked around it. The message was indirect but clear. Reputation became the punishment. Social withdrawal signaled disapproval. Reintegration required compliance, apology, or disappearance. Women targeted by gossip often tried to correct misunderstandings, but explanations struggled to compete with collective belief. One voice could not outweigh many. Attempts to clarify could be reframed as defensiveness. Silence could be reframed as guilt. There was no safe response once gossip had gained momentum. What is especially troubling is how normalized this system was. Gossip felt harmless because it was ordinary. It blended into daily life, masked by familiarity. Yet its consequences were severe. It determined who was trusted, who was avoided, and eventually who was accused. This form of surveillance required no authority, no rules, and no enforcement beyond social pressure. It operated continuously, quietly, and efficiently. Everyone learned how to participate and how to fear participation in equal measure. As the story moves forward, it becomes clear that which accusations did not begin in courtrooms or sermons. They began in conversation. They began with someone saying, "Have you noticed?" and someone else replying, "I thought I was the only one." Once enough people shared the same unease, that unease felt like truth. And when truth is decided by repetition rather than evidence, accusation becomes not only possible, but inevitable. Church stood at the physical and moral center of colonial communities. It was the most regular gathering place, the most visible display of unity, and the clearest expression of shared belief. In theory, it was meant to offer spiritual guidance and comfort. In practice, it functioned as a public stage where conformity was measured, observed, and silently enforced. Attendance was not optional in any meaningful sense. To be present was expected. To be absent required explanation. Each absence was noticed, counted, and remembered. Illness, distance, or weather might excuse a missed service once, but repeated absence unsettled people. It suggested detachment, resistance, or improper priorities. Faith was not considered private. It was a performance, and church was where that performance was evaluated. Inside the meeting house, visibility mattered. Seating arrangements reflected status, reputation, and moral standing. Who sat where, who arrived early, who lingered after all of it was quietly tracked. A woman's posture during prayer, her attentiveness to sermons, and her reactions to Scripture were read as signals. Looking distracted could appear disrespectful. Looking too intense could appear excessive. There was again a narrow range of acceptable behavior. Church services themselves reinforced vigilance. Sermons emphasized discipline, obedience, and the ever-present possibility of moral failure. They reminded listeners that danger did not always come from the outside world. It could come from within the community, hidden behind familiar faces. This message encouraged watchfulness rather than trust. It taught people to look for signs. For women already under quiet suspicion, church became especially stressful. It was the one place where avoidance was impossible and scrutiny was guaranteed. Their presence did not shield them. It exposed them. Every movement felt amplified. Every reaction felt recorded. The effort to appear appropriately devout became exhausting. Public confession added another layer of pressure. Admitting wrongdoing was framed as moral responsibility, but confession also created vulnerability. Once a woman confessed to even minor failings, those admissions could linger in communal memory. They shaped how others interpreted her future behavior. Confession was meant to cleanse, yet it often became another form of evidence. Silence during confession carried risks as well. A woman who did not speak when others did could be viewed as proud or unrepentant. The system offered no neutral option. Participation risked exposure. Non-participation risked suspicion. Either choice fed the same cycle. Church discipline extended beyond the service itself. Leaders monitored behavior between gatherings, often informed by community reports. Moral correction was not limited to doctrine. It extended into daily life. Personal disputes, domestic conflicts, and social tensions were drawn into religious evaluation. Faith became a tool for regulation rather than reflection. The language used in sermons shaped how people understood misfortune. Hardship was rarely framed as random. It was framed as meaningful, corrective, or revealing. This worldview encouraged people to search for moral causes behind every negative event. When suffering appeared nearby, the question was not what happened, but who was responsible. Women whose lives already seemed unconventional were especially vulnerable to this thinking. Their difference made them easy candidates for moral explanation. If something went wrong, it felt logical within this belief system to look toward those already viewed as unstable or questionable. Church also blurred the line between spiritual authority and communal power. Religious leaders were not distant figures. They lived among the people they guided. Their opinions carried weight not just in matters of belief, but in social judgment. When a leader expressed concern about someone's behavior, that concern echoed through the community. Importantly, the church did not need to directly accuse anyone to contribute to accusation. It only needed to reinforce the idea that vigilance was virtuous and that hidden wrongdoing was always possible. This atmosphere made suspicion feel righteous rather than cruel. For many women, the meeting house became a place of performance rather than peace. Faith was expressed carefully, guardedly, with an awareness of how it would be perceived. Authentic spiritual struggle had little room to exist. Doubt was dangerous. Questioning was risky. Certainty was rewarded, even when it was shallow. Over time, this environment trained people to associate morality with visibility. What could be seen, heard, and evaluated mattered more than intention or context. A woman's inner life became irrelevant compared to how convincingly she displayed obedience. When formal accusations eventually emerged, church records, attendance patterns, and remembered behaviors provided ready-made support. What had once been routine observation became retroactive evidence. Ordinary moments were reinterpreted through the lens of guilt. The tragedy of this system lies in its distortion of faith. A space meant for reflection became a place of fear. A community meant to offer care became an arena of judgment. And belief, instead of fostering humility, encouraged certainty about others. As the story continues, it becomes clear that the witch trials were sustained not just by fear, but by institutions that normalize scrutiny. When spiritual life becomes inseparable from social surveillance, trust erodes quietly. And once trust disappears, accusation no longer feels like betrayal, it feels like duty. In colonial American communities, misfortune was rarely accepted as accidental. Illness, crop failure, sudden death, or unexplained hardship were not viewed as random events unfolding in a complex world. They were treated as messages. Something had gone wrong, and that wrongness demanded a cause that could be named, located, and addressed. Uncertainty was deeply unsettling, and assigning blame felt more manageable than accepting unpredictability. When a child fell ill or livestock died without a clear reason, the question was not whether it could have happened naturally, but why it happened here and now. Timing mattered. Patterns were searched for. Who had been nearby? Who had spoken harshly? Who had recently argued or been denied help? These questions narrowed the field of suspicion toward people already viewed as different or difficult. Misfortune did not need to be extreme to raise concern. A series of small problems could accumulate into a sense that something was wrong. Repeated headaches, spoiled food, strange sounds at night, or tools breaking unexpectedly all fed the same unease. Individually, these events were ordinary. Together, they felt meaningful. And meaning demanded explanation. Women were often drawn into this process because they occupied the spaces where misfortune appeared most visible. They cared for the sick, prepared food, tended animals, and managed households. When something went wrong in these areas, their proximity made them convenient explanations. Proximity, however, was mistaken for responsibility. The belief system of the time encouraged this logic. Hardship was understood as purposeful. It was either corrective, revealing, or punitive. This framing left little room for coincidence. If suffering occurred, someone must have caused it, either directly or indirectly. Searching for that person felt like moral obligation rather than speculation. Once a potential cause was identified, memory began to rearrange itself. Past interactions were revisited and reinterpreted. A disagreement became hostility. A refusal became spite. A neutral expression became resentment. Events that once felt insignificant gained new weight when viewed through the lens of harm. What made this process especially dangerous was its emotional reinforcement. Fear sharpened perception. Anxiety made connections feel obvious. The more frightened people became, the more certain they felt. Doubt faded quickly in the presence of collective unease. Misfortune also created urgency. Communities believed that failing to address hidden wrongdoing would invite further harm. Delay felt dangerous. Action felt protective. In this environment, accusation became a form of defense. Removing the suspected source of harm promised relief, even if no evidence existed. Women with prior reputations for being unusual, independent, or socially isolated were particularly vulnerable. Their difference made them easier to imagine as sources of unseen influence. Familiarity reduced suspicion. Distance increased it. A woman who lived quietly at the edge of the community could quickly become the center of explanation. Importantly, people did not always believe they were being unjust. Many truly believed they were responding to real danger. Fear distorted empathy. The suffering of one person became less important than the perceived safety of many. This moral calculation justified extreme measures while preserving a sense of righteousness. Once misfortune was attributed to human intent, it became self-reinforcing. If harm continued, it confirmed suspicion. If harm stopped, it validated the action taken. Either outcome supported the same conclusion. There was no scenario in which the accused could be proven harmless. Attempts to argue for chance or natural causes struggled to gain traction. Such explanations felt unsatisfying. They offered no control and no resolution. Accepting randomness required humility, patience, and restraint, qualities that fear actively undermined. This pattern transformed grief into accusation. Instead of processing loss, communities redirected pain outward. Blame offered emotional clarity. It turned suffering into something that could be confronted, punished, and removed. In this way, accusation became a coping mechanism. The tragedy lies in how this mechanism prioritized certainty over compassion. Real human suffering was compounded by imagined guilt. Women who were already vulnerable became vessels for collective fear, burdened with explanations they never chose. As this story unfolds, it becomes increasingly clear that which accusations thrived in moments of crisis. They offered answers when none were available and comfort when none could be guaranteed. But that comfort was temporary and costly. It replaced understanding with punishment and left deeper wounds behind wounds that certainty could not heal. In colonial American life, survival depended on practical knowledge. People relied on experience rather than formal education, and much of that experience lived in the hands of women. They knew how to grow food, preserve it, treat common illnesses, assist in childbirth, and respond to everyday injuries. This knowledge was essential, widely used, and quietly respected until fear entered the equation. When anxiety rose, usefulness could quickly be reinterpreted as danger. Women who possessed specialized knowledge occupied an unstable position. They were sought out in moments of need, yet rarely granted lasting trust. Their skills worked, but the reasons those skills worked were not always understood. In a culture uncomfortable with uncertainty, effectiveness without explanation felt unsettling. People accepted help when they were desperate, then questioned it once the crisis passed. Healing knowledge was especially vulnerable to suspicion. Women prepared remedies from plants, experience, and observation. These remedies were not mysterious to those who practiced them, but they lacked the language of authority. There were no written credentials, no formal approval. Knowledge passed quietly, often from older women to younger ones, shaped by trial and error. This informal transmission made it difficult to defend when questioned. Success could provoke as much unease as failure. If a treatment worked, people wondered how. If it failed, they wondered why it was attempted at all. Either outcome fed doubt. A woman who seemed too effective could be imagined as drawing from improper sources. A woman whose help did not bring relief could be blamed for worsening the situation. Midwives faced similar dangers. They were present at moments of intense vulnerability, birth, pain, fear, and uncertainty. Outcomes varied, as they always had, but memory was selective. Success was normalized. Loss was remembered. When grief followed childbirth, it often attached itself to the most visible participant. Proximity again replaced responsibility. This suspicion extended beyond healing into any form of competence that exceeded expectation. A woman who understood animals well, who could predict weather patterns, or who managed resources efficiently stood out. Competence disrupted assumptions about gender and hierarchy. It challenged the idea that authority flowed only from sanctioned sources. That challenge did not need to be spoken to be felt. What made this especially dangerous was how quickly respect could turn into resentment. People relied on knowledgeable women, but reliance created dependency. Dependency, in turn, threatened self-image. When discomfort grew, suspicion offered relief. Casting doubt on the source of help restored a sense of control. Knowledge also created asymmetry. A woman who knew more than others possessed power, even if she never used it intentionally. In anxious communities, power was rarely trusted unless it was clearly defined and supervised. Informal expertise slipped through these structures, making it feel unregulated and therefore risky. Attempts to hide knowledge offered limited protection. Women learned to downplay their skills, to present them as accidental or inherited rather than learned. They framed experience as luck rather than understanding. But concealment carried its own risks. A woman who refused to help when asked could be labeled unkind or suspicious. A woman who helped too often could be seen as intrusive or manipulative. The contradiction was inescapable. Usefulness was expected, but visibility was dangerous. Women were asked to know, but not to seem knowledgeable. To act, but not to appear intentional. To help, but not to influence outcomes. These expectations were impossible to meet consistently. As fear spread, practical knowledge was stripped of context and reframed symbolically. Remedies became rituals. Experience became intent. Pattern recognition became foresight. The ordinary process of learning from life was transformed into something secretive and deliberate. Once suspicion settled, past actions were reevaluated. A successful treatment months earlier could be remembered as unnatural. A correct prediction could be recast as foreknowledge. Ordinary coincidence hardened into imagined design. The more a woman had helped in the past, the more material existed to reinterpret. This process discouraged the sharing of knowledge. Women became hesitant to pass on what they knew, aware that teaching created witnesses, and witnesses created risk. Over time, communities lost valuable skills, but fear felt safer than preservation. The tragedy lies in the irony. The very people who kept communities functioning through care, experience, and labor became the easiest targets when those communities felt threatened. Practical knowledge, born from necessity, was punished as transgression. As the story continues, this pattern reveals a deeper truth. The witch trials were not driven by ignorance alone, but by discomfort with unsanctioned power. When knowledge exists outside formal control, fear seeks to contain it. And when containment fails, accusation becomes the tool of choice. In colonial American communities, economic status did not provide safety. Instead, it placed women along a spectrum of suspicion where both ends carried risk. Poverty and prosperity, though opposite in appearance, could each be interpreted as signs of moral instability or hidden wrongdoing. What mattered was not wealth itself, but whether a woman's circumstances fit neatly within communal expectation. Poverty marked women as vulnerable and exposed. Those with few resources relied more heavily on neighbors, charity, or informal exchange. This reliance made their lives more visible and their movements more noticeable. Requests for help could be remembered as entitlement. Refusals could turn into resentment. Over time, desperation was imagined where none existed, and need was reframed as threat. People feared that poverty created motivation for harm. A woman who struggled to feed herself or her family could be imagined as capable of desperate acts. This belief did not require evidence. It rested on assumption. Hardship was linked to moral weakness, and moral weakness was believed to lead to wrongdoing. The reality of structural scarcity was rarely considered. At the same time, women who experienced unexpected prosperity faced a different but equally dangerous scrutiny. Wealth demanded explanation. If a woman's material comfort appeared to exceed what her labor or status should allow, people wondered how it was obtained. Prosperity that could not be traced to approved sources disrupted the social narrative. Comfort without clear origin felt illegitimate. This suspicion intensified when prosperity appeared alongside independence. A woman who owned land, managed finances, or lived comfortably without obvious male oversight unsettled expectations. Her stability challenged assumptions about dependency and hierarchy. Rather than being admired, such autonomy often provoked unease. Economic change, whether upward or downward, was especially risky. A sudden improvement in circumstances invited questions. A sudden decline invited speculation. Stability was valued, but only if it aligned with communal norms. Any shift suggested hidden influence at work. Material goods became symbols. Clothing, furniture, livestock, and household items were scrutinized. Too little suggested neglect or failure. Too much suggested greed or improper acquisition. There was no safe middle ground because the middle was never clearly defined. For poor women, aid came with observation. Charity was rarely anonymous. It carried expectations of gratitude, humility, and compliance. A woman who accepted help but maintained dignity risked being labeled ungrateful. A woman who expressed frustration risked being seen as resentful. Either response could be remembered unfavorably. Prosperous women faced different pressures. They were expected to demonstrate modesty and generosity without appearing superior. Any refusal to share resources could be interpreted as selfishness. Any generosity could be reinterpreted as manipulation. Wealth magnified visibility rather than reducing it. Economic stress within a community heightened these dynamics. When resources were scarce, comparison intensified. Envy mixed with fear. Differences felt sharper. A woman's economic position became a point of reference in times of crisis, guiding where blame might fall. Importantly, these judgments were not consistent or fair. They shifted based on emotion, circumstance, and existing reputation. A woman already viewed as unusual would have her economic status interpreted negatively regardless of direction. Poverty confirmed suspicion. Prosperity confirmed it as well. Attempts to manage perception rarely succeeded. Hiding resources could appear deceitful. Displaying them could appear boastful. Sharing too much could appear strategic. Sharing too little could appear hostile. Economic life became another area where intention was assumed and innocence was difficult to prove. This environment encouraged self-restriction. Women limited what they acquired, how they displayed it, and how they discussed it. Comfort was muted. Need was downplayed. Survival strategies became quieter, more cautious, and more isolating. The deeper tragedy lies in how economic narratives replaced empathy. Instead of recognizing poverty as hardship or prosperity as good fortune, communities moralized both. Women became symbols of imbalance rather than individuals navigating difficult conditions. As the story continues, it becomes clear that the witch trials were not about extremes of wealth or deprivation. They were about deviation. Any condition that set a woman apart, economically or otherwise, could be reshaped into a reason for suspicion. And once suspicion took hold, material reality mattered less than the story people chose to tell about it. In colonial American communities, conformity was presented as protection. The unspoken belief was that fitting in, behaving correctly, speaking carefully, and following expected routines would keep a woman safe. But in practice, conformity was not a shield. It was another test, and one that was often impossible to pass. For women already under quiet scrutiny, the very act of trying to fit in could be reinterpreted as evidence of manipulation rather than sincerity. Once suspicion began to form around a woman, her behavior was no longer evaluated on its own terms. It was evaluated for motive. Ordinary actions were filtered through a lens of doubt. If she adjusted her habits to align more closely with community norms, people wondered why she felt the need to change. Improvement did not signal goodwill. It signaled calculation. A woman who became more reserved might be seen as hiding something. A woman who became more social might be seen as attempting to influence opinion. A woman who increased her church attendance might be seen as overcompensating. Every correction carried the risk of being read as strategy rather than growth. This created a cruel paradox. The rules of acceptable behavior were enforced, but following them too carefully raised alarm. Conformity was expected to be effortless and invisible. Any sign of effort suggested intention. And intention, once suspicion existed, was dangerous. Communities expected morality to appear natural. Goodness was supposed to flow without friction. When a woman seemed to work at it, people questioned her authenticity. Why was she trying so hard now? What had changed? These questions did not arise from evidence, but from discomfort with visible adaptation. For women who had already been labeled unusual, attempts to soften their image often backfired. A formerly outspoken woman who became quieter was seen as suppressing her true nature. A woman once known for independence, who sought guidance, was seen as disingenuous. Change was not interpreted as learning, but as concealment. This suspicion extended to emotional expression. A woman who appeared calmer after conflict could be accused of emotional control rather than reflection. A woman who appeared kinder could be accused of seeking favor. Emotional regulation, which today might be praised, was then often viewed as manipulation. Even apology carried risk. Admitting fault could reopen past grievances and reinforce negative reputation. Not apologizing could be seen as pride. Apology had to be perfectly timed, perfectly worded, and perfectly receive conditions that were largely outside the woman's control. The pressure to perform. Acceptability intensified in moments of crisis. When misfortune struck nearby, women who sensed growing suspicion tried to make themselves less noticeable. They altered routines, avoided conflict, and reduced visibility. Ironically, this withdrawal often increased attention. Change itself became suspicious. What made this especially devastating was the lack of feedback. Women rarely knew which behaviors were being watched or how they were being interpreted. They adjusted blindly, hoping to land within an invisible boundary. When that boundary shifted, they were blamed for failing to anticipate it. The community's response reinforced this cycle. People discussed these changes among themselves, comparing impressions and reinforcing shared conclusions. Individual observers might have doubted their own interpretation, but consensus dissolved doubt. Once multiple people agreed that behavior seemed off, it felt confirmed. In this environment, sincerity was impossible to prove. Trust had already eroded. Any action could be reframed to fit suspicion. A woman could not demonstrate innocence because innocence was no longer the question. The question had become intent, and intent was assumed rather than examined. Over time, this system trained women to suppress adaptation itself. Learning, growth, and self-correction became risky. Stagnation felt safer than change. Remaining exactly as one had always been, even if that behavior had once drawn criticism, seemed less dangerous than visible adjustment. This reveals a deeper truth about the witch trials. They were not driven by behavior alone, but by narrative control. Once a woman's story was written by others, her actions served only to illustrate that story, not to change it. The tragedy lies in how conformity was weaponized. Women were told to blend in, yet punished for trying. They were judged not only for who they were, but for how they attempted to become what was demanded of them. As the story nears its conclusion, it becomes clear that safety was never truly available. The standards were not designed to be met. They were designed to be enforced. And in such a system, effort itself becomes incriminating because it reveals awareness, and awareness, in a culture of fear, is often mistaken for guilt. By the time suspicion fully settled over a woman in colonial America, innocence had already lost its power. What mattered was no longer what she did, but what others believed she represented. Once a community began to see someone as a possible source of harm, every action became secondary to interpretation. Guilt was no longer something to be proven. It was something assumed, waiting only for confirmation. At this stage, logic no longer guided judgment. The absence of wrongdoing was not reassuring. In fact, it could deepen unease. A woman with no clear offense invited speculation. If nothing obvious explained the fear surrounding her, then something hidden must exist. The unknown felt more threatening than the known. This is where accusation became almost unavoidable. When a community experienced fear, whether from illness, failed crops, unexplained deaths, or personal conflict, it searched for a cause that could be named. Abstract explanations were unsatisfying. Chance offered no comfort. But a person could be confronted, questioned, punished. Once attention fixed on a particular woman, the process fed itself. Every new misfortune appeared to validate earlier doubts. Each coincidence was absorbed into a growing story that made sense only because people wanted it to. The narrative hardened, even as the evidence remained thin or non-existent. The accused woman's responses rarely helped her case. Fear made her hesitant. Hesitation was seen as evasion. Calm was interpreted as unnatural. Composure. Emotion was interpreted as instability. There was no correct way to react because reaction itself had become suspicious. Silence did not protect her. Speaking invited misinterpretation. Defending oneself could be reframed as argument. Agreeing could be reframed as confession. The social space available to her collapsed until nothing remained but accusation and response, both equally dangerous. Once formal accusations emerged, community memory transformed. Past interactions were re-examined and reshaped. Ordinary disagreements gained darker meaning. Neutral events were recalled selectively. Even kindness was retroactively reinterpreted as influence or deception. Witnesses did not need to lie to cause harm. Many genuinely believed what they said. Human memory is flexible, especially under pressure. When authority figures asked leading questions, people filled in gaps unconsciously. Their certainty grew with repetition. The legal structures of the time reinforced this imbalance. Accusations carried weight, while defense required clarity and consistency under extreme stress. Contradictions natural in trauma were treated as proof of dishonesty. The process favored narrative over nuance. Perhaps most devastating was how isolation intensified. Once accused, a woman often found former allies withdrawing. Support became risky. Association itself could spread suspicion. Fear discouraged intervention, even from those who doubted the accusations. This isolation created a psychological trap. Without reassurance or perspective, the accused woman was left alone with the community's version of her identity. She was forced to confront a story in which she played a role she never chose and could not escape. The trials were not simply moments of cruelty. They were outcomes of a system that trained people to see danger, indifference, and meaning in misfortune. The accused were not targeted because they were powerful, but because they were vulnerable enough to absorb collective fear. Innocence in this context was irrelevant. The trials did not ask whether someone had caused harm. They asked whether someone could carry blame. And once selected, that role was difficult to shed. What remains most haunting is how ordinary this process was. No grand conspiracy was required. Just neighbors watching neighbors. Just fear seeking shape. Just stories repeated until they felt true. The women who suffered were not symbols in their own time. They were people navigating daily life under impossible expectations. Their punishment did not come from single acts, but from accumulation from glances, whispers, and remembered moments stitched together into certainty. In the end, the witch trials reveal less about belief in the supernatural and more about the danger of unchecked suspicion. They show how easily communities can turn vigilance into persecution and how quickly fear can replace empathy. This is why these stories endure. Not because they belong to the past, but because the mechanisms that enabled them, fear of difference, hunger for explanation, and comfort in shared blame, are deeply human. When innocence depends on perception rather than truth, it becomes fragile. And when fear decides who belongs, anyone can fall outside its protection. That is the quiet lesson left behind by these women, not of magic or mystery, but of how quickly ordinary lives can be undone when suspicion is allowed to speak louder than understanding. As we step back from the full arc of this story, one truth becomes clear: the witch trials were never only about belief or superstition. They were about fear looking for certainty, about communities struggling to maintain control in a world that felt unstable and unforgiving. Ordinary people facing hardship and uncertainty chose explanation over compassion and suspicion over patience. These stories matter because they remind us how easily fear can reshape judgment and how fragile fairness becomes when belonging is conditional. The women caught in these accusations were not extraordinary figures, they were neighbors, caregivers, workers, and survivors of their time. Their experiences warn us what can happen when difference is treated as danger and silence is mistaken for guilt. Thank you for taking this journey through history with us today. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see the past and the present a little differently, then it has done its work. Thank you for listening, and we will see you in the next story.